I'm Tim Henriques with the Fantasy Book Ranking System, and in today's review we're going to check out a book that you may not have heard of. It's called Ren of Atikala, and this is the first in a series. I'm only reviewing book one. This is called the Kobolds series, so I'm only reviewing book one. There is a series which is not yet complete out there, but there is a series for that, but I'm only just going to review book one all by itself as a standalone novel. For those of you who have not seen this system before, the idea behind the Fantasy Book Ranking System is really to help you, the reader, decide if this is a book that you want to read. You only have so much time, and so you want to kind of know going into something whether it's worth it or not. And I found that when I read other reviews on Amazon's, everything seems to get 3.5 to 4.5 stars. It's really difficult to know what the person likes even after reading the entire review. So what I want to do is I want to compare this book to then other books that you likely have read, and that way you can decide, oh, we have the same taste and I'm going to like this or not. I'm also going to describe some key characteristics so you can decide, oh, that's something I'm looking for or that's not something I like in a book. That way you can just make a better, more educated guess as if you should read the book or not. There is a secondary goal that I created this, which is to be a little bit selfish. I wanted to kind of understand what makes really good fantasy books tick. I'm trying to dip my toe into the writing of fantasy as well. I've written some nonfiction books, but I want to kind of get into that new world, so I wanted to help better understand what made those things awesome. So that was one reason for creating this. So the way this is going to work, pretty simple, is I'm going to rank the book on a scale of 1 to 10. 10 is super awesome and epic, and 8 is pretty solid. 6 and below is not very good, and then I'm going to go through 15 different kind of attributes of each book and describe what I think is a 10 and where the book falls. I'll also go over some flaws that I found, some strengths that I thought, my overall impression, and then at the end I'll give the book its own unique individual FaBR score so we can then compare it to other fantasy books. So let's get started. So for this first one, how epic is the story? This would be about a 7.5. There's kind of a cool like beginning, a big explosion, all this stuff happens, which is not a surprise, and then we got to travel around and do some different things. So I'd say 7.5. It's not super broad yet. It is possible that the series will get more broad, but it's relatively cool. Something like Star Wars, Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings is going to be a 10 for an epic story. How well written is it? It's a 7. I thought this was, reasonably well written. That's definitely not a strength, though. It's getting into a little bit of the negative. So, I felt like the book could have used a second round of editing. There were some cool descriptions in there, but I certainly wasn't blown away by the reading, and I think probably on a second reading it would be more bothersome. Something like Name of the Wind would get a 10 for super well written prose. How real did it feel? Again, I didn't really feel like I was there. I felt like I was more watching the story. I personally don't mind that kind of a system. I don't really feel like Star Wars is that real, to be honest with you, but I feel like you're more watching that story as well. So that's still highly ranked, but this would be a more 7. If you want something really real feeling, like First Law Trilogy to me is going to be the best for that. What lessons are taught? I thought the author was trying to go over some lessons. So the author is David Adams, kind of I believe a newer independent author, trying to kind of get into the game, so to speak. And so there's definitely some lessons in there, but still not a massive strength, not something that I was left with forever. I read this book about 6 months ago, so main lessons aren't just jumping out at me. Something like Star Wars would get a 10. Is the book a page turner? Yeah, the author kind of creates a bit of an interest in the story. Then you kind of wonder what's going on. There's usually some drama on there, so I think you're inclined to want to finish the story once you start, at least for the first one. So I'd give that an 8. Something like the Da Vinci Code, Maltese Falcons would be a 10 in that level. How memorable is the story? It's kind of a unique story, so that part is relatively memorable. So the protagonist is memorable, and the story itself is reasonably memorable. So I'd give that an 8. Something like Star Wars would get a 10, where you really remember almost like every part of that story. The main character is probably the biggest strength of the book, in my opinion. So basically, the main character is a kobold. If you're familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, that's like a small little kind of 4-foot, basically goblin equivalent. That's generally pretty wimpy, and they kind of survive by having huge numbers. And so this story is told from the perspective of a kobold, which is pretty cool. And I'm a pretty big Dungeons and Dragons freak, so I thought that was pretty awesome. So I would say this is not like an epic Conan style character, but still pretty memorable. Certainly, if you've ever thought, I wish someone wrote a book about kobolds, you're definitely going to want to check this one out. Secondary characters, I mean, they're memorable to me because they involve some Dungeons and Dragons things. There's like a copper dragon and a gold dragon in there, which is kind of cool. But on the flip side, I don't remember their names. I don't remember too much about them. So then I didn't find the secondary characters all that memorable. The one she travels with is kind of up there, but still, to me, that was not a huge strength. And I think in that setting, you could make that even more cool. Something like Star Wars would get a 10 for all the memorable secondary characters. How much did you want to read the next book? Not a massive amount. The story was interesting, but you only have so much time. There's a lot of super good fantasy books out there, and so I felt like I kind of got the flavor of the first one, so now I was just wondering what's going on with the story. Also, the series is not complete yet, so I didn't really have a huge desire to race through the first 3 or 4, only to then be left for a couple of years wondering what's going to happen. So for me, only a 6.5. Something like Game of Thrones would be a 10, where you really are just can't wait to kind of read that next book. How rereadable is it? I'd give this a 6. I don't think it'd be super rereadable. I think you can pretty much pick it all up on that first read, and I don't think on subsequent reads the story would get any better. In fact, I think then you'd probably be a little more frustrated with some of the flaws that were taking place in the story. So only a 6. Something like Game of Thrones would get a 10. How clear is good and evil? This one's more murky. First, kobolds are typically evil, and you start off from their perspective. So in the story, kobolds are good, and then humans are evil. But then even within that, what is good and evil gets a little bit mixed. And then this kobold, has a little bit more of a soft heart and kind of challenges things. But they do try to mix it and make it a little bit murkier, which is both done well and then occasionally frustrating at the same time. But it's definitely not as super very clear like a Star Wars episode 4, 5, 6 might be. How prevalent is magic among the world? I mean, it is Dungeons and Dragons, so there are magical creatures, and there's some wizards and things like that in there, and that's like a known thing. So I'd say moderate among the world, and then the main character, the kobold, has some mage in her, and so some dragon blood in there, so she can then cast spells and things like that. So that would be a reasonably high level among the main character. What age? I would say 12 plus, so there's some relatively gory deaths and things like that in there. I personally would have read it to my younger kids, like 10 or whatever, but on the error of caution, I think 12 plus. So far, there hasn't been like a whole bunch of sex and stuff, although they talked about mating and things like that in there. So it's not like a Game of Thrones kind of thing, but 12 plus I think is appropriate for this. Is the series finished? No, to my knowledge, the series is not yet finished as of this review, so that you can get a couple books in, but the series is not yet finished, although they do seem to be coming out at a decent clip to his credit. So flaws the book had, it's not super well written. It had a few moments where you're like, oh cool, like okay, that was well done, but there's also kind of a little bit more blah moments and some things that kind of take away from it. I definitely felt like I could have used another round of editing. It wasn't just like filled with typos, but just shorten this up here, make this more succinct, make this more clear, another go through. I felt like it's probably a bit of a rush to put it out. There were definitely some logical flaws as well, which didn't make sense. It was kind of a time period gaffe where he talked about, oh, you got to put alcohol on there for prevent infection. And to my knowledge, no one in the Middle Ages had any idea that there was germs and infection and things like that. Even though it's Dungeons and Dragons, they still didn't know that kind of stuff. So that was kind of a little bizarre. Secondary characters not super memorable. And then something that's just worth noting, I mean, the book is not huge. The font is, pretty good size, so you'll blow through this pretty fast. And at least when I got it, it was about 15 bucks. So obviously if you can think, oh, I can buy Game of Thrones for 10 bucks or this book for 15, and it's going to take me a quarter of the time and isn't as well written, it's a little tough to compete. I do like the fact that it's kind of self-fulfilling author out there, self-published, I believe. So I can certainly appreciate that, but still it felt a little pricey and didn't quite compete with the other books. So it is a cool concept, writing from a kobold's point of view, and definitely to me some of the strengths was seeing things that we see in everyday life through a kobold's eyes. Even like the way that kobolds saw like this gnome that was sweating, and it was like, what the hell is this fluid leaking out of this? It was like a cool kind of description, so I appreciated that. It is very D&D centered, and being a D&D geek, I thought that was pretty awesome. It's got interesting descriptions. We just went over that. The main character is a female, so for often that's a strength in kind of this male-dominated fantasy field. The writing isn't poor, but it's definitely not a strength, and it might get aggravating over time. It's not incredibly inclined. I was not incredibly inclined to continue the series. I felt like, okay, I got a good idea. If they were all in front of me and I had a whole bunch of time, I could see possibly doing it, but I haven't done it yet. But if you do love kobolds, you're going to want to say, oh, okay, I definitely going to give this book a whirl. So overall, I would give this book 73. It's got some interesting points. Almost any book that at least has gone through some editing and stuff like that is kind of a worthwhile read. You learn something from it. But again, when you consider how much time you have, I can't rank this book super high as of now, given all the other books that are out there. So that's the score for this particular book. If you're interested in this kind of review system, feel free to keep watching this YouTube channel or check out my other reviews on timhenriques.com. If you have any of the books you want me to review, or if you have different questions or comments, or you just think I'm an idiot, feel free to post in the marks below and we can chat about it.